This balloon represents your uterus and your cervix, and the ball in there, that's your baby. Now here's the thing, as long as you're only just having false contractions, your cervix is not gonna dilate. But when you are in true labor, here's what's gonna happen.
The muscles of your uterus contract and push your baby downwards, which causes your cervix to thin out and dilate so that your baby can move into the birth canal. Now, the only question is, how do you know that you are in true labor?
Well, if you ask 10 different people, you're most probably gonna get 10 different answers, right? Some people will tell you that true labor means that your contractions come like every 20 minutes. Others will say that it's true labor if your contractions come every 5 minutes. So who is right and who is wrong?
Well, the answer is they are both right. The only problem is they don't distinguish between the early and active stage of labor. So in this video, we are gonna share with you the most important signs that you are in true labor and how these signs are different depending on whether you are in early or active labor.
Right. This is Nathalie, a pregnancy and birth consultant and TCM therapist.
And that's Mathias, a researcher and science geek.
And we love helping mummies and their babies naturally and science-based. So let's get started.
Okay, so first of all, please note that when a woman goes into labor, she first goes into early labor, in which she dilates to about 3 centimeters. But then, in order to dilate further, she needs those very strong contractions. And that's the kind of contractions a woman experiences in active labor, which is the stage after early labor.
Now, let us first start by explaining what a woman normally goes through as she goes into early labor, if her labor progresses in a steady line, which is not always the case, as we're going to see, right? So first, you may experience an increase of Braxton Hicks contractions. Not in the sense that you would permanently feel Braxton Hicks, it's more like that you would feel these fake contractions more frequently than normally, right? This could be hours before you go into early labor, but it could as well be over a period of several days or even weeks.
Yes. As we have seen at the beginning, these false contractions don't really help dilate your cervix. Their purpose is more like warming up the muscles of your uterus, which is why they are often called practice contractions. And because of that, many women experience more Braxton Hicks contractions as they're getting closer to early labor.
Yeah, and then normally these Braxton Hicks contractions change into mild to moderate but real contractions, which normally means that you have entered the early stage of labor. And because these real contractions that you experience in early labor already dilate your cervix, many doctors argue that if you are in early labor, you are essentially in true labor.
Yes. Now, if your early labor progresses in a steady line, then the early stage of labor normally only takes hours or a few days tops before you move into the active labor stage.
Yeah.
And when that's the case, dilating to 3 centimeters does not take too long. However, keep in mind that for some women, early labor can also take weeks, which is why many women don't even recognize that they are in true early labor.
Yeah.
Also because not every woman feels contractions in that stage. In fact, some women may dilate even though they don't feel any contractions at all.
Yeah, but eventually you are going to progress from the early to the active stage of labor, which again is when you will be feeling very strong contractions. It's the stage of labor when your midwife is going to tell you to come to the hospital because now your body makes some serious progress in terms of your cervical dilation, right? And that's the very reason why most of the times when people talk about true labor, they actually talk about active labor.
Right. But the reality is, no matter if you're in early or active labor, in both cases you are in true labor, because in both stages you're gonna experience real contractions which help dilate your cervix.
Yeah.
The only difference is that the contractions feel and behave differently in each stage. So the next question is, how do you know that you are in early labor? And then also, how do you know that you have progressed from the early to the active stage of labor?
Well, most people are going to tell you that you are in early labor if you experience one or several of the following so-called early signs of labor. Your baby has dropped, mucus plug discharge, bloody show, diarrhea, more back pain, and other signs. The problem is, though, that some women, particularly second-time moms, only experience these signs once they are already in active labor.
Right.
Insofar, the term early signs of labor is a bit confusing, right? Because they are not necessarily signs that you are in early labor.
Right. And because of that, all you can really do if you want to find out if you are in true labor is to look out for real contractions. So let's first have a look at how real contractions are different from false contractions, and then afterwards we are going to look at how real contractions feel and behave differently depending on if you are in the early stage or active stage of labor.
Yeah, so the first sign that you're having real contractions is that they no longer disappear when you change either your position or your activity. Like whatever you do, they don't go away.
Right.
That's very different from Braxton Hicks because they normally disappear when you, for example, sit down instead of standing, or when you walk instead of sitting, or when you take a bath.
Right.
So that's one thing.
The other thing is that real contractions are gonna feel different compared to Braxton Hicks. Now, we are not gonna lie to you. Explaining what real contractions feel like to someone who has never experienced them before is very difficult. Also because every woman experiences contractions in a different way. Some describe them as very strong menstrual cramps. Some say it's a dull pain at the back or lower abdomen. Some say that contractions either start in your back or on your sides and then move to the front of your abdomen. Other women say it's the other way around, and then again other women say that contractions feel like diarrhea cramps.
Yes, in fact, real contractions may start similar than Braxton Hicks, which often feel like a tightening or squeezing kind of pain, or like menstrual cramps. But the key here is that Braxton Hicks normally start very strong and get weaker eventually,
Right.
but they're not overly painful, right? Real contractions, on the other hand, behave differently. They are getting stronger over time.
Right, but not only that, true labor contractions are also much more organized than regular. False contractions really come as it pleases them, right? They are quite irregular. Real contractions, on the other hand, come in more or less regular waves. For example, it could be that they come, let's say, every 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, and then finally, one thing that you would also observe is that your contractions come in closer and closer intervals. So in short, how do you know that you experience real contractions? Well, first of all, check if your contractions disappear when you either change your position or your activity. Second, check if you can identify a pattern, like do your contractions come in more or less regular intervals? And third, check if that pattern changes over time, because what's going to happen is that your contractions are going to get stronger and again come in closer and closer intervals over time.
Right. Okay, so now that you know how real contractions differ from false contractions, the question is, how are real contractions different depending on whether you are in the early or active stage of labor?
Well, the problem is that in the early stage of labor, not every woman experiences real contractions in the same way. The active stage of labor is different, right? Because most women experience that stage in a similar way. But in early labor, some women hardly feel any contractions at all, or their contractions are quite irregular. In other cases, a woman may feel that her real contractions come in closer and closer intervals, but then all of a sudden there is no activity at all, only for events to pick up speed a few hours later.
Right.
But in general, most women are going to feel mild to moderate contractions when they are in early labor.
Right. At first, these contractions may be quite irregular. But if your early labor progresses in a steady line, then you're going to notice that your contractions suddenly come much more organized and more frequently.
Yeah.
At first, they may only be some 20 to 30 minutes apart. But then they are going to come in closer and closer intervals.
Yeah, and most importantly, they're gonna get stronger.
Right.
So if your early labor does progress in a steady line, this phase normally only lasts a few hours, maybe a few days before you go into active labor.
Right.
But again, for some women, this phase may take weeks. But even in that case, eventually you are going to observe that the contractions are going to get stronger, become more regular and organized, and come in closer and closer intervals.
Right. So how do you know that you have progressed to the active stage of labor? Well, eventually your contractions are going to come in intervals of 4 to 5 minutes. They are going to be much stronger compared to when they started, and they are going to last between 30 and 70 seconds, but most likely something between 45 and 60 seconds. And this is when you are normally in active labor.
Yeah, it's also the stage of labor when your partner normally starts to sweat. In fact, that's another great sign that you are in true active labor, right? Ignore your contractions. Just check the heart rate of your partner as your partner starts to realize that maybe he should get you to the hospital.
All right. A final word on active labor. Some people will tell you that you are only in true labor if your contractions come every 5 minutes, last for 1 minute, and if you have experienced them for at least 1 hour. This is the 5-1-1 rule. And so many women have asked us if it is relevant to have contractions for at least 1 hour before calling the midwife.
Yeah, well, in our opinion, it really does not matter, because no one is going to blame you if you are calling your midwife if your contractions come back like every 5 minutes and last for 1 minute, no matter if you have experienced them for 1 hour or not.
Right.
The only thing that could happen is that they will tell you to only come to the hospital once you have experienced the contractions for at least 1 hour. But this really depends on the staff.
Right. So to sum up, the challenge is not so much about finding out if you are in active labor. Trust me, once the strong contractions start, you will know.
Yeah.
What can be a challenge though is to understand if you are in early labor. And that's simply because every woman experiences early labor in a different way.
Right. With that said, we really hope that you have found this video helpful. If you did, we would be super grateful if you could leave us a like. And for more useful tips and tools on pregnancy and baby related topics, make sure to subscribe to our channel and to hit the bell.